Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Happy Valentine's Day. I'm sharing my love for all of you with this extra video this week. I've reached over 200 subscribers now, which is much faster than I reached my first 100. So let's keep this going. I'm very appreciative to all of you. And what better way to celebrate Valentine's Day than with a box of chocolates? And since this is a mystery novel channel, why not make it a box of poison chocolates? Today, I will review Anthony Berkeley Cox's classic novel, The Poison Chocolates Case, featuring his amateur sleuth, Roger Sheringham. And before I begin, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. As always, I will begin my review with a spoiler free summary up until the point of the killer reveal, which I will warn you when it's coming. After that point, spoilers are free game. And this book is unusually structured, and I'll get into that. This book features a group of six amateur crime solvers who have taken on the unsolved case of the poisoned chocolates. Each of the six develops a different theory as to what happened, and because of the unusual structure of this book, I decided to cut off the spoiler free part a little earlier than I would normally. I've decided to cut it off after the fourth proposal, even though I probably could go a little further. And if you've read this book, you'll understand why. All right, let's get into it. The Poison Chocolates Case is the fifth Roger Sheringham novel, and the one that begins a streak of truly fantastic novels with Sheringham. It's a clear divide, in my opinion, of the quality of Sheringham novels, including this one and after, than the ones before it, with these being much better in quality, although I find them all pretty good. And there are also plenty of standalone Barclay novels under the name, also of the name of Francis Isles and A Monmouth Plots. The Poison Chocolates case was first published in 1929, 95 years ago, and I would consider this a milestone anniversary for this book. Anthony Berkeley loved to challenge his readers. He was always experimenting with new techniques and new ways to fool readers and new ways to tell stories. This book begins with Sheringham addressing a meeting of his crime circle, a group of intellectual crime enthusiasts who, very much, if they existed today, would be like the type of people obsessively listening to like true crime podcasts and like Discovery ID all the time. And Sheringham is the president of this club, and he tells them about the poison chocolates case with his friend slash rival Inspector Moresby. Moresby is not a member of the crime circle, but is a guest of Rogers to introduce this problem to the group. And I'll say right off the bat here, I love this book, but I do think this is a particularly bad book for Inspector Moresby. He feels very bland and just off than in his other appearances. He's depicted as a good friend of Roger's, but in past books and in future books, he often finds Roger infuriating. They sort of like a love-hate relationship, especially after like the case of the Vane mystery, where Moresby just loses it on him. But in this book, there are friends, and Moresby is completely baffled by the poison chocolates case. The police have basically nothing, and we get a bit of backstory of this case in their conversation. It's an infamous case that the media and the public are just absolutely gripped into. I got the sense it was a bit like the Nicole Brown, Ron Goldman murders that O.J. Simpson was caught up in. The murder plot begins at a London men's club called the Rainbow Club, where one Sir Eustace Pennyfather received a box of chocolate liqueurs from Mason and Sons through the post from an unknown individual. And this is like a fairly common occurrence in mystery novels with victims or potential victims in this case receiving just unknown food parcels in the mail. And I think this they don't think it's weird at all. But I don't know if this was like extremely common in the 1920s, but I certainly would never eat anything through the mail that I didn't know where it came from. Sir Eustace thinks it's the company trying to get him to promote their new product. He's actually insulted by this, but he doesn't want it, and he throws out the wrapping and the letter that came in the box, but both are retrieved. And a lot of time is dedicated to analyzing both of them, but to be honest, neither is really that important, nor is it the most interesting about this book. But Sir Eustace does not want the chocolates, so he gives them to a fellow member named Graham Bendix, who lost a bet with his wife Joan when she correctly identified the villain of a play they attended, and he owes her a box of chocolates as payment. This bet is fairly well known publicly even before the murder, which we learn in not really the most convincing manner, but it's satisfying enough. And Mr. Bendix brings the chocolates home where he shares them with his wife. Both of them are taken ill, and while Graham recovers, Joan dies from nitrobenzene poisoning. A big deal is made of the fact that she ate a lot more of the chocolates than Graham did, and that the taste of the poison would have been disguised by the liqueurs. There's a heavy variety of liqueurs, very strong liqueurs in the candy, so you wouldn't taste the poison. There is a question of who the intended victim was. Sir Eustace is a known womanizer. He is married, but is having an affair with a young, naive girl who trusts him implicitly and perhaps some other people. Joan and Graham Bendix had a marriage that was sort of on the rock, although very little time is actually given to the idea that Graham was supposed to be the victim. But we'll get into this further. Each of the six members of the crime circle is tasked with coming up with his or her own solution to the crime. Inspector Moresby will listen in on these theories in case there is anything to help the police, but he is doubtful. They draw lots to determine the order, which provides a lot of humor in this book. This book is so lighthearted, which is very different for the time. In this era, we did not really have unserious mystery novels, with crime being considered no laughing matter, but in this book, it's treated as a game and a contest. The idea is proposed that they pool their information together so they can come up with one solution to help police, but they all reject it, clearly indicating they don't actually care about justice. Each of these six people, except maybe Mr. Chitterwick, in his first appearance here, is so competitive and willing to stop at nothing. They don't want to work with other people. They want to be the one to solve the crime. And most of them are upset and concerned that someone else will reach the correct solution before it's their turn to go, and thus they won't receive the credit. Little squabbles are always breaking out, and Roger, as president, has to quell them whenever he feels like it. The humor is certainly one of this book's biggest and most unique selling points for me. Five of the six of them are just very eager and find this project exciting, while Ambrose Chitterwick is a little more reserved. He's mostly baffled as to how any of these people are supposed to go about detecting when the police have failed, which leads me to question the credibility of these other crime circle members. I think it's just a bit of an open question of how much we can trust these other people. We don't actually see them detecting about London, and because of their competitive nature and how exciting they find this project, I'm not totally certain we can trust everything they say. How much of the detecting they claim to do they actually do is up in the air, and each person has a different approach as to how they want to go about this, and a different part of the case they believe is the most important. And we can tell pretty much right away that Mrs. Fielder Fleming, Alicia Dammers, Morton Harrogate Bradley, and Sir Charles Wildman already have an idea in their heads without doing any active work. The first to present is Sir Charles Wildman, who is nothing like his surname would suggest. He's a lawyer and obsessed with facts. If we're to treat each of these people as sort of representative of a type of fiction, Sir Charles is the traditional mystery, old school, like Philo Vance type stories where it's just strictly on the facts for him. He's obsessed over facts and tries to fit all the facts together without really going on speculation. He's dismissive of Alicia Dammers, the novelist, and her heavy focus on psychology, which, is really just a code word for sex here. And he's very cut and dry. I mean, the book makes a point of saying that Sir Charles can use facts to his advantage without having to warp them or misinterpret them. He's defended successfully many people who were murderers and got them off scot free simply with facts that should have been incriminating, but he turns them around. He does go on a bit of an ego trip as he delivers his theory. He claims the moral high ground, but even though his daughter is involved with Sir Eustace, she's like the young woman that is known to be having an affair with him, and she does so against Sir Charles's wishes. And so he has very clear personal stakes in this murder, despite his own claims that he's completely neutral in it. And he focuses primarily on the inserted letter from Masons and Sons that comes with the chocolate box. He determines that the murderer is Sir Eustace's wife, Lady Pennyfather, and makes a number of comparisons to Marie Lafarge, who was a French woman accused of poisoning her husband in a very sensational case in the 1840s. It was one of the first, if not the first, like murder trials and cases to be in the public eye in such like a sensational way. The nation was really tuned into it, and there remains a lot of questions, even today, of whether or not she was guilty or innocent. Sir Charles accuses Lady Pennyfather of a switcheroo here. He claims Lady Pennyfather lied about visiting and staying in France, when in reality she visited France briefly and then traveled back to England to post the poisoned chocolate box to her husband while her maid was masquerading as her in France to provide an alibi. Sir Charles has photographic evidence of Lady Pennyfather on the Strand around the time the box of chocolates had to be posted from there. And he goes on about one of his agents finding out all of this information very quickly. And he makes a point of saying how, as he went first, he had like the least amount of time to prove his theory, so he had to cut corners. And as a lawyer, I think we're supposed to trust him a little bit. He's not presented as like outright dishonest, but he is a defense attorney who gets results by any means necessary. And he admits that he always had Lady Pennyfather in mind and didn't really try to be objective and look at other options, which he mostly blames again on the short time span that he had. Sir Eustace asked Sir Charles's approval to marry his daughter once his own divorce was finalized, but Lady Pennyfather would not give her husband that divorce unless he left her his entire estate, to which he agreed. So the motive theory here is money because Sir Charles is very rich. And the other members of the crime circle really are just not impressed with this theory. I mean, the two women are angry as they see Sir Charles as a misogynist for accusing the wife. And Mr. Bradley and Mr. Chidwick find the theory fine. Like, they don't have any real problems with it, but they say that Sir Charles did not actually prove anything, that he only proved that Lady Pennyfather could have done it, not that she actually did do it. And then we have our first big squabble here with Alicia Dammers, a novelist. I suppose she's a mystery novelist. It's not really made clear what she writes. And she criticizes him for having an unsupported theory that's basically garbage, to which Sir Charles replies that her own books are garbage then, because he modeled his theories after her books, which, a little questionable there. And Mr. Bradley gets into it with Sir Charles as well and makes jokes about his underwear, which I have to say, always, every time I read this book, this joke just falls flat for me because the terms are just really old fashioned and I kind of just don't get it without having to look it up. But apparently, this was quite the insult. And Roger, who is leading the table, just allows these things to be said unless, like, they beg him to stop it. He does not do a good job of moderating the debate. And Miss Dammers concludes this section by saying she knows Lady Pennyfather has an alibi, so she couldn't have done it. And the group is sort of left thinking, well, like she could have done it, but they're not like totally convinced. So they decide to wait until they hear from another person. Mrs. Mabel Fielder Fleming, the playwright, is the second person to present on a different day. She is extremely overdramatic in her story, and she gives with this melodramatic speech about how burdensome this was for her because she did solve the case and she's so torn up of what to do with it. She's never had anyone's life in her hands before. And she makes a number of references to Edgar Wallace, who was a writer of some very over the top detective novels in the day. And she also cites the Molyneux case, which was another sensational murder in New York, very similar to the murder in this book, in which a pharmacist named Edward Molyneux, who was acquitted of murder after it was alleged he mailed poisoned bromo seltzer to Harry Cornish, who ran the famous Knickerbocker Club. And a cousin of Cornish's drank the bromo and died. And all of this information is presented in the book. A lot of these people do reference real life murder cases, but they're all explained in the book. So you don't have to do like any extra research, which is very convenient because the first time I read this book, I just was not familiar with many of them. And Mrs. Fielder Fleming goes on a winding tangent about triangles that aren't necessarily love triangles. It's not really difficult to follow, but she does ramble quite a bit before getting to the point. And Sir Charles gets angry with her mainly because she doesn't stop talking. And she also appears to be like dancing around accusing his daughter without actually saying so. However, she eventually accused Sir Eustace of wanting to marry Miss Wildman, who is Sir Charles's daughter, for his money. And Mrs. Fielder Fleming claims she spoke with Barker, who is Sir Eustace's valet, and with Miss Wildman's maid. and she heavily implies she bribed both of them for this information, which leaves Mr. Chitterick wondering if this information is even good, but she refuses to hear that. And she eventually gets to her point and accuses Sir Charles of trying to murder Sir Eustace, but accidentally killing Mrs. Bendix instead. And she does this in like almost a Shakespearean way here. And I'm going to do something I don't do very often and quote directly from the book because it's just such a fantastic quote here. Quote, heedless of the chair overturning behind her with a dull, doom-like thud, her quivering finger pointing across the table, she confronted Sir Charles with every inch of her 5 foot nothing. Thou, shrilled Mrs. Fielder Fleming, thou art the man. Her outstretched finger shook like the ribbons of an electric fan. The brand of Cain is on your forehead, murderer. Unquote. And everyone finds this just really humorous and makes jokes about how they're sitting with a murderer. And clearly, no one like really buys this accusation, especially since she too cannot prove Sir Charles secured the nitrobenzene poison, and she dismisses that as insignificant, which is also something Sir Charles did. They don't really care too much about being able to prove someone had access to the poison because just simply doesn't fit in with their theory, so they just throw it out. And neither could prove their accused actually secured this poisoning, so they know they just claim it doesn't matter. But interestingly, Sir Charles fails to defend himself here, which prompts more jokes from Roger and Mrs. Dammers about Sir Charles being the murderer, and they should try him right then and there. And eventually, Sir Charles says his daughter no longer wishes to marry Sir Eustace, and everyone's like, well, I guess that's good enough. He didn't do it. No one but Mrs. Fielding Fleming even came close to believing this accusation, so they just put the accusation aside, which, is just a really funny moment from the playwright who agrees Sir Charles is innocent because she thinks all emotions should be unanimous and just goes along with it because everyone else is. It really comes across that Mrs. Fielder Fleming had no idea of a theory, so she just accused Sir Charles because she didn't like him and then couldn't defend her own theory when challenged. Mr. Bradley presents third. His real name is Percy Robinson, and he is a writer of detective fiction. Mr. Bradley very much is a trope of common themes in mystery fiction. He complains about how everyone expects him to do the mystery writer thing and name the least likely person as the culprit, and is disappointed because he says Mrs. Fielder Fleming already did that. And he's primarily interested in the nitrobenzene, which he considers the most important aspect, already criticizing the other two who ignored it. The poison is used in pretty much everything and is easy to make, yet not a lot of people seem to know about it. Initially, it appears he's going to accuse his sister of the murder, which, is just really bizarre, but then he explains he's not actually going that route. He claims he had his friends experiment to see how easy it was to open the box of candy and poison the chocolates without leaving any clues behind, and determines that he was the only person he knew who could actually do this. And throughout this speech here, it does seem like at points he's going to accuse himself and confess to the murder. He references another real life murder case, that of Dr. Wilson of Philadelphia, who drank poison ale that allegedly came from the brewery on the label, but it actually didn't. And this is kind of a bit icky here, where Dr. Wilson performed abortions, and Mr. Bradley uses, the derogatory term abortionist in such a way that makes it seem like he supports the murder of Dr. Wilson. And he compares Wilson to Sir Eustace, and there's certainly commentary to be made here, but that's best left to other channels besides this one. And Mr. Bradley does the Philo Vance slash Ellery Queen thing of developing a list of 12 traits the murderer must possess, and then does in fact name himself as the murderer as the only person who meets all of those requirements. And humorously, he wonders what his own motive was and decides they either had like amnesia or thought he wanted to do like the Leopold and Loeb idea of committing a murder for the sake of murder. And this book was published 8 years before Trial and Error, but you can see inklings of that book here where Mr. Bradley says he may have just committed a murder to rid the world of someone horrible like Sir Eustace, who is bad enough to qualify. And of course, Bradley then says he didn't actually commit this murder. He then drops yet another bombshell here and says that he doesn't actually think Sir Eustace was the intended victim. Being the first person to really vocalize this idea, Bradley says he learned Sir Eustace had a meeting with a woman, and it is his belief that another woman set Sir Eustace the chocolates to give to that woman he was meeting with, in effect murdering that other woman and getting her out of the picture. And he accuses a Mrs. Vereker le Mesurier, whom we have met in like a short interstitial chapter. She knows Roger, and this accusation goes nowhere fast. I mean, Roger says no, she didn't do it. And then Mr. Bradley also quickly agrees. And neither Bradley nor Roger actually name Mrs. Vereker le Mesurier out loud, but she is named in the narration, so the reader knows who it is. And I'm not really sure like what is so special about her that like she can't be named, but they don't do it until, later on in the book anyway. And Roger is up fourth. And throughout the novel, we had these like short passages of Roger investigating. He looks into like the theater the Bendixes intended that led to the bet between the husband and wife, and a printer's office where he buys an expensive typewriter after the clerk identifies a man in the photo Roger shows him. He begins by correcting himself. He no longer wishes to alibi Mrs. Vereker le Mesurier and says that she must remain a suspect, although he doesn't actually believe she did it. Rogers speaks a lot about luck and how luck is a major factor in the way Scotland Yard solves crimes. This is sort of like an unwarranted dig at Moresby, who is still attending these meetings here. And Roger really seems to poke fun at Moresby, even though Moresby is just so much more competent at solving crimes than Roger is. Roger is wrong in about half of his novel appearances and never really seems to accept that, so he blames luck for why Moresby is the one who's always correct. And Roger also name drops the Avenging Chance, which is a Barclay short story of which the Poison Chocolates case is an expansion of. So that's a fun little Easter egg there. And Roger goes on a bit of an ego trip here as well, and the two women at the table grow extremely frustrated at how rambling he becomes, with Mrs. Fielder Fleming accusing him of being dramatic, which, some irony there. And Roger claims this murder is perfect, to which Sir Charles claims it can't be perfect if Roger thinks he solved it. Roger, really more than the others, discredits the previous theories, especially Mr. Bradley's. He throws out most of Mr. Bradley's 12 characteristics the murder must possess. Sir Charles was obsessed with the Mason and Sons letterhead paper, and Roger reveals that that paper was stolen from a sample book at the printer shop, so any reasoning about like connections made to the paper a suspect may have is just thrown into the void. He also shocks the group here by revealing Mrs. Bendix had already seen the play in question and knew the villain's identity. He then goes into some psychology and makes the point that Mrs. Bendix was a very nice woman, and not the kind of woman who would make a bet, and certainly not the kind of woman who would cheat when making a bet. He then shocks the group further by stating he doesn't believe anything went wrong with the murder plan, essentially meaning that Mrs. Bendix was the target all along and that Mr. Bendix killed her. He sent the poisoned chocolates to Sir Eustace at the club, where he could easily intercept them and then hand them off to his wife. The fact that there was poison in the chocolates, in Roger's mind, would indicate that the target was always a woman. It would be weird to try to poison a man that way, especially Sir Eustace, who didn't really eat chocolates. And combining that with Mrs. Bendix's personality not meshing with her bet, Roger reasons the only possible culprit is Graham Bendix, who needed his wife's money. And we are treated to the signature Roger sharing him misogyny because he says he doesn't really blame Mr. Bendix because his wife was boring. And he also has this like really bizarre claim that the unspoken rules of British public university brotherhoods would never allow a publicly educated man like Mr. Bendix to murder another man in this underhanded way, but it doesn't forbid him from murdering a woman in that way. And there's a lot of discussion in this book about honorable ways to murder someone if you're an upperclassman. And this is classism clouds a lot of thinking in the 1920s and 1930 murder mysteries, most notably, and then there were none, but it's also very much on display here. The others, particularly Miss Dammers and Mr. Bradley, constantly try to poke holes in Roger's case, but Roger dismisses them without any real explanation. Whenever someone raises a point, he just like simply doesn't address it. And Mrs. Dammers refuses to concede that Rogers is correct and vows to prove him wrong. And she does not agree to adjourn the meeting, which the others consider very shocking, but the meeting is adjourned anyway. And this is where I'm going to end the spoiler-free section. Now, there are two more theories to tell, and you are probably safe to listen a little longer if you don't want to be spoiled, but I did decide this is probably the proper place to warn you. Alicia Dammers, the novelist, is the fifth of six people to present her theory. She's very excited to prove Roger wrong, so it is a bit surprising that she begins with agreeing with Roger that Mrs. Bendix was always the target. She gets a lot of joy in criticizing and undermining Roger, and she says that Mrs. Bendix isn't so nice as Roger thought, which is a very common trap Roger falls into. He often refuses to believe a woman would commit certain kinds of murders or do anything underhanded. It is a big weakness and failure of his. And she claims that she has proof the bet it was in fact made. Mrs. Bendix told her maid and a mutual friend she shares with Miss Dammers about the bet. So our novelist was also brazen enough to call Graham Bendix himself, who told her he was at the Rainbow Club outside of his normal hours because he was expecting a call from an actress named Vera Delorme, with the not so subtle implication the two were having an affair, even though those two seemingly didn't really know each other. However, Miss Delorme denies she told Bendix she would call that morning. Miss Dammers theorizes that Mrs. Bendix pretended to be Miss Delorme to see if her husband would take the bait. She takes great pleasure in telling Roger that pretty much everyone whom he spoke to lied to him to make sales of expensive typewriters and paper and whatnot, and he wasted his money. And this narration has a lot of fun with this. At one point, it says Alicia Dammers spoke over Roger's corpse to describe just how hurt and devastated he was. As she claims, Mr. Bendix wasn't really in debt, as any brief query would have proven, calling Roger lazy for not being more thorough here, as she eventually drops her bombshell claim that Joan Bendix was having an affair with Sir Eustace, and uses pretty graphic phrases to indicate this by 1929 standards, as she describes a bed being disheveled. And she bribed a waiter to confirm this. She then accuses Sir Eustace of murdering his mistress, and during her explanation, she tells a story she learned from her maid that one day before the murder, Sir Eustace came to Mrs. Dammers' flat, but she missed him. And Miss Dammers realized that her copy of Taylor's Poison Manual was stolen, and accuses Sir Eustace of stealing it to learn about nitrobenzene. She then theorizes that Sir Eustace tricked Mrs. Bendix into pretending to be Miss Delorme to get her husband to the Rainbow Club at 10:30, where he would show up with a box of poison chocolates, trick Mr. Bendix into taking them and giving them to his wife, where she would eat them and die. She compares this crime to another real-life murder committed by John Tawell, who killed his mistress to prevent them from becoming a known couple. And everyone is just absolutely in favor of this idea Miss Dammers has, and used information provided by the previous four theories while disproving Rogers. It really seems like she has crossed all her T's and dotted her I's here. Mrs. Fielder Fleming is ecstatic that a woman figured it out. However, Mr. Chitterwick, while not dismissive of Alicia Dammers, wants his own turn as he is the only person left to go, and everyone agrees to give him the chance. Mr. Chitterwick finally gets his turn. Throughout this book, Mr. Chitterwick was really the only person taking the project seriously in terms of legitimately wanting to solve it for the sake of justice. He was always the most respectful of the Crime Circle Club. He rarely, if ever, ridiculed others and always tried to consider their theories, even if he didn't truly believe them. That makes him the most personably likable of this group, but also the least interesting, as he stayed out of the arguing and the squabbles, for the most part. He begins with reviewing the previous theories, and there is a very helpful chart in the book here to help the reader remember. Mostly, Mr. Chitterwick counters a number of points made by Miss Dammers, and he does so very meekly. Mr. Chitterwick is anything but assertive, as we see in his other novel appearances as well. Mainly, he takes issue with Miss Dammers' assertion that the murderer need not be intelligent. He strongly disagrees with that. He actually thinks this is a very cunning murderer. Mr. Chitterwick is all over the place as he delivers his theory, but he does eventually get to his point, and it goes something like this. Miss Dammers' theory is mostly correct, but it is incorrect in a few very important places. She is correct the intended victim was Mrs. Bendix, and she is correct that Mr. Bendix was lured to the Rainbow Club. However, his idea is that Mr. Bendix was lured to the club not so he could receive the box of chocolates from Sir Eustace, but rather so he would witness Sir Eustace accept the box in the post. And this to me is a bit of a weak spot, which I'll get into in my critique. I think if one believes Mr. Chitterwick's solution is the correct one, I do have some holes here. But Mr. Chitterwick's other point is more compelling in that the box of chocolates was sent to the Rainbow Club, so Sir Eustace would bring the chocolates to his lunch appointment with a woman. However, the lunch appointment was canceled unbeknownst to the killer, but the chocolates still wound up murdering Mrs. Bendix by chance, as was their intention. Everyone is begging Mr. Chitterwick to just like spit out the killer's name, and he fumbles about and never actually like names the person outright. Miss Dammers grows more and more frustrated, and initially appears is because she doesn't like her theory being torn apart, but then suddenly Miss Dammers just ups and leaves the meeting before Mr. Chitterwick finishes, and it sort of just like clicks in everyone's mind here that the person Mr. Chitterwick is indicating as the murderer is Miss Dammers as a discarded mistress of Sir Eustace. As Mr. Chitterwick explains, Miss Dammers had hoped Sir Eustace and Mrs. Bendix would eat the chocolates at their lunch appointment, where they would both die, in what would look like a murder suicide plot perpetrated by Sir Eustace. Sir Eustace was in love with Miss Dammers, but fell out of love with her for Miss Wildman, and then dumped Miss Wildman with Mrs. Bendix, both of whom were rich, and he was mostly interested in their money. And Mr. Chitterwick explains that Miss Dammers essentially gave away the game when she was presenting her theory. When she accused Sir Eustace, she claimed she went to his flat and saw all this incriminating evidence, like the typewriter that must have been used, and the right kind of pen, and the paper from Mason and Sons, and the Taylor Poison book that she let slip was originally hers. By trying to incriminate Sir Eustace, she gave away that she too had access to all of the incriminating evidence. Mr. Chittook admits he can't actually prove this, and the book ends with the crime circle just like completely baffled as to what happened and like what course of action should they take with this information. We have no real resolution about what they ultimately decided to do with this information. Now, we learn in the next Roger Sheringham novel, Second Shot, that Miss Dammers is living in a nearby village the action of the story is taking place in, with no indication she is a murderess, so I think we can assume that she not only got away with murder, but that the crime circle didn't even bother going to the police. Though, strangely, in like the Piccadilly murder, Mr. Chitterwick has a reputation of having solved the murder, which you do wonder if like anyone does know after all. And of course, I think a reader here could argue that Mr. Chitterwick's theory is wrong. I certainly have holes with it, but more on that later. So let's move on to praise. I rank this book number 4 of 18 Anthony Berkeley mysteries, and I think there's a serious argument this book should be number 1. It was a hard decision for me, but this book is fantastic. It's so iconic of detective fiction. The interplay between these 6 detectives, I mean 7 if you count Moresby, but he's not really in on the action, is fantastic. Each one is so competitive with the other 5. Even Mr. Chitterwick has his moments. It makes the novel. I think The Poison Chocolates Case is a book that could have suffered on a reread, like I think like Murder on the Orient Express does, but it's this interplay that keeps this book from becoming dull and is just more than a comedy. I mean, the mystery here is so well crafted, geniusly crafted. Each theory leeches off of the one that preceded it. When new information comes to light, subsequent detectives either incorporate that into their theory or work to dismiss it. I sort of glanced over it a bit in my summary, but these detectives do make attempts to use evidence, and it's fascinating how each of the 6 of them interpret like the same piece of evidence in different ways and draw different conclusions from it. There's a lot of shenanigans over like the letterhead and the typewriter, and in the end, they don't really mean all that much, especially when compared to like the psychological aspects of the story. But I think this book, more than any other book, shows Barclay's genius as a crafter of crime fiction, being able to use simple items like a typewriter or a basic murder plot and develop 6 equally convincing arguments. Really, 7 if you count the accusation Mr. Bradley makes against himself. And this book is a bit ambiguous as to which is correct. Now, I think we're supposed to assume Mr. Chitterwick is correct and Alicia Dammers is guilty, but we get no confirmation of that, and I have holes in that theory that don't get addressed, but I also think you can argue that's intentional. Barkley was always experimenting with new ways to handle detective fiction, and like Agatha Christie, was always pushing the bounds of the established rules, which is why I consider him the second greatest mystery novel writer of all time after Agatha Christie. Christie and Barkley are the two foremost writers who elevated detective fiction beyond this like strict belief that the point of the story was to reestablish order. This book is one of the first mystery novels to treat murder as a fun game, which really matches what readers were doing. I mean, readers loved to see if they could outdo the detective, but the novels were so serious and lacked this sort of lighter elements to them. This book is a 10 out of 10, and I am reconsidering that fourth place ranking because this is one of the best mystery novels of all time. I think it's just so much fun and so interesting. It's a very short novel. My edition is fewer than 180 pages, and it's so much fun and it's such a breezy read. And despite all of that gaiety, it is still a very competent mystery novel mechanics wise. It's genius. And this style has been emanated many, many times since. It's not quite of the same pattern as like Five Little Pigs or Dyed in the Wool, which have similar formats, but in those cases, we don't get theories presented by detectives, but accounts from suspects. But one can still see how influential this book was and remains today. And the final praise here comes from the characters. They are all fantastic. I mean, the six detectives are just so much fun in their arguments and their squabbles, and how they're always trying to outperform the others. They nitpick and don't always make sense when they do so. And when presented with actual counterfacts, they just dismiss them as nonsense because they're so competitive and they want to win. No one, except maybe Mr. Chitterwick, actually cares about justice for the victim. I love the way Barkley matches their personalities to the way they approach the case, the person they accuse, and the real life comparison case they use as a launching point. It's magnificent. And the fact that Barkley was able to achieve all of this in such few pages and with such strength and genius really goes a long way in explaining why I think he is the second greatest mystery novelist of all time. And speaking of which, Mrs. Bendix is the least developed character in the story, and it's intentional. She does not matter. She is merely a tool for those people to have their fun in their little contest. The victim in the story is the least important person in it, and it works. It's intentional. And I think by not having a developed victim, it allows these other characters to have these theories about her and make their own assumptions about her. I think if she was strongerly developed, this book might have suffered. Now, I do have some pieces of criticism, but honestly, not that many. I do have some issues with Mr. Chitterwick's theory, which the book presents as the correct one. I think you can argue whether or not it is correct or is it intentionally constructed with holes in it, because Mr. Chitterwick himself lacks confidence just in general. He's of nervous disposition, so he gets muddled in his thoughts. But if we are supposed to accept his theory that Miss Stammers is the killer, and she committed the murder in the way he says she did, which Miss Dammers seems to imply is true, then I have some issues. I don't understand why she had to lure Graham Bendix to the club. I understand she wanted to essentially incriminate and murder Sir Eustace and murder Mrs. Bendix, and it sort of imply like she didn't want suspicion to fall on Mr. Bendix, but I understand why she had to lure them to the club. And Mr. Chitterwick says it's so there's a witness that Sir Eustace had the chocolates, but the mail clerk who handed him the box, the Rainbow Club, would have sufficed as a witness. And this part seemed like a weak explanation for an item that was part of the story to be there for other people's theories. Again, this is a group of amateurs, so I think it's okay that not everything is wrapped up in a tidy bow, and it could be intentional. It's not a big deal for me. Another issue that's not a really big deal for me either is that this book isn't really solvable. I mean, the reader cannot have the same fun of trying to solve this murder as the characters do, because we're not given any real information until the theories are presented. Now, I think you can solve this at like the very end, in like the middle of Mr. Chidwick's theory, and maybe as early as Alicia Dammers if you catch that she essentially incriminates herself. That's why I cut off the non-spoiler part before her theory, but Still, that's quite late into the book. But this isn't like the kind of novel we're supposed to be able to solve. This is one of Barclay's experiments in telling a story, and it's a very good one. I'm not mad this book isn't truly solvable, in my opinion. I mean, some other minor issues, I wouldn't consider it such a big deal, but I suppose a reader might find the background of this case a bit of an info dump. And there is some minor misogyny, as is typical for Barclay. It doesn't bother me at all in this book because it's very minor and all the characters are mocked relentlessly. And it's not like this like male superiority over women theme here. And there are a few things that work out conveniently in the plot, like the order everyone has to deliver their theory and certain people finding out information by chance. But even this is lampshaded in the book and made fun of, and none of it detracts from the book overall. Let's move on to the characters here. We can start with our three figures central to the actual murder, Joan and Graham Bendix and Sir Eustace. These three are not well developed, and it's intentional. I mean, the crime circle does not treat these people as people, but merely pieces of their game that exist for their own entertainment. So their lack of focus and development is intentional. Yet we do know things about these people, and we know what the Bendix's marriage is like. We know Sir Eustace is a Casanova. I think if they were more developed, it would have detracted from the crime circle. So for me, these characters serve the purpose they need to and don't need to do anything extra or anything special. Onward to Roger, and this is one of Roger Sheringham's most positive appearances. He's generally difficult to find likable, and I'm not sure it's entirely intentional, but in this book he is seen as jovial and not as chauvinistic as normal, although he does get his digs in. He has great interplay with the other crime circle members, especially Miss Dammers, and he is reading him grow angrier and angrier and more frustrated when Miss Dammers just rips apart his theory is so fantastic. I always loved how Rogers lets the other members argue and doesn't really assert himself unless someone begs him to. It really allows the fun and tensions of the book to flow. And of course, Roger is wrong in this book. This is his fifth appearance, and it's at least the second time his solution was wrong, arguably the third. In total, Roger is wrong in like roughly half of his book appearances. I've always liked that about him. He's an amateur detective and not a very good one. He's very different from the likes of like Poirot or Sherlock Holmes, who, while they make mistakes, really come off as infallible. And Roger feels much more human in his flaws, although it does make him less endearing. His accusation of Mr. Bendix is not the first time he's sort of blamed the husband for a crime. And Roger is not only chauvinistic, but unsurprisingly, really doesn't understand women at all. I mean, both Miss Dammers and Mrs. Fielder Fleming scold him for his incorrect reads of Mrs. Bendix. Roger has like this weird belief that women are kind of dumb and they pick the wrong husband, so he has to just like swoop in and be their savior when he's not needed and when they don't want that. You know, in the Witchford poisoning case, which was three books previous, and no spoilers here, but Roger tries to prove a woman innocent of poisoning her husband, basically because he finds her attractive and is implied that he wants to marry her. And this is like a similar situation here where Roger goes out of his way to incriminate the husband to quote unquote save the dead wife. And naturally, he's wrong. And we have Roger once again not liking husbands of attractive women and finding him particularly envious of them. Inspector Moresby is in a similar vein as like Mrs. Bendix. He plays an important role, but nothing significant. Roger bounces ideas off him and he provides the backstory. And this isn't a good book for Moresby, who comes across as just like really bland and like a second fiddle to Roger. And there was a give and take to their relationship, but it's just not present in this book. And Moresby hates when he gets involved in his work because Roger has a habit of messing everything up, and that dynamic just isn't here. And now Berkeley does use Moresby to poke fun at the police a bit. I mean, this because Mrs. Bendick's murder remains unsolved. Moresby dismisses that as the culprit is a lunatic, so the police just can't do anything about it, implying, the police are lazy. Miss Alicia Dammers is a great character, done in by her own intelligence. There is a bit of misogyny in her character, as Barclay depicts her as a woman too smart for her own good, and that it's dangerous for a woman to be as smart as she is because she'll do evil things. And I think she has a great downfall, however, as her beef with Roger and her desire to outdo him accidentally leads to her incriminating herself when she frames Sir Eustace. Again, this is where the misogyny comes in again, as she gets too emotional. Her fiery hatred for Sir Eustace causes her to take the risk and expose just how she committed the crime. And she doesn't stick around to defend herself or face the music. It doesn't bother me, like I said, because all of these characters are mocked and it doesn't come across so poorly as I think it sounds when I talk about it in isolation, like I'm doing now. But she is a genius woman and a genius character. She's one of my favorite murderers in any mystery novel, and I give credit to Barkley for making a woman murderer. And this isn't the only time he does this. I mean, this book was written in 1929. And for much of the 1920s, writers didn't really use women as murderers very often. And if they did, they were either like the femme fatale type or just like dumb women. Now, Miss Dammers is the woman scorned, but she's not the femme fatale. She's a charming middle-aged novelist of I guess it's implied to be romance novels or like mystery novels. It's not clear exactly to me what she writes, but she's very different from the rare female murderers of the day. Sir Charles Wildman is a barrister through and through. He is constantly in lawyer mode while delivering his theory. His choice of murderer, Mrs. Pennyfather, is exactly who would expect an unimaginative lawyer to accuse. When someone is killed, or in the case of Sir Eustace, almost killed, the natural suspect is the husband or the wife. Sir Charles comes across as like a very basic character and also as a very basic detective. He does everything by the book and doesn't really speculate beyond what is right in front of him. And he investigates in a similar manner as he defends his clients. He had a determined outcome already in mind and worked tirelessly to reach that outcome, even if the journey there wasn't so solid. And unlike the others, Sir Charles doesn't take that much offense when people try to disprove him. It's not that he doesn't take offense at all, but as a lawyer, he only cares about the outcome. Whenever he raises objections, he always does so challenging facts. He's just as competitive as his fellow crime circle members, but without going into like ridiculous lengths. His daughter is brought up a few times, and he always defends her without becoming the overprotective father. He actually handles it quite well. And he's also a surprisingly interesting character, especially for like these middle aged male lawyers who I often find to be bland and blend together. Mrs. Mabel Fielder Fleming is probably my favorite character in the book and the one I struggle to pronounce the most. She is this so over the top and dramatic. She brings it in every scene. She is a playwright, but she delivers her theory like a prima donna actress, and it's just spectacular. She is performing when it's her turn, and she accuses Sir Charles, and it's sort of maybe out of revenge for him accusing Mrs. Pennyfather, which she seemed to resent. And she represents what I believe Barclay would consider the more feminine aspects of detective fiction, more domestic issues. She spent a lot of money allegedly bribing servants all over the place, playing off the common trope of the serving class being heavily involved in detective stories. She is definitely portrayed as more traditionally and stereotypically feminine than Alicia Dammers, although she's also paid a great deal of respect career wise. She's probably the one who is the least experienced and familiar with detection. She feels more of the amateur amongst the group of amateurs, but she is just ridiculously entertaining. She delivers every time her mouth is open. I just couldn't get enough of her. Mr. Morton Harrogate Bradley, which is an alias for Percy Robinson, is a mystery novelist who, of course, has the approach of naming the least likely suspect, which he determines is himself, which is really funny. Although he does switch to Mrs. Vereker le Monsieur, another very unlikely suspect, and probably even more unlikely than Mr. Bradley from like a meta reading standpoint. And I love Mr. Bradley as well. He admits that just because he writes about crime doesn't mean he knows anything about detection. In fact, he admits he knows nothing and it doesn't really seem to do that much actual work. We are privy to his internal thoughts, and we learn he doesn't actually like the people in the crime club. Like, he certainly doesn't like Roger or Sir Charles at all. And he's the one who is most focused, I would say, on the psychological nature of people. He's the one wondering the hardest if a public school man would murder someone in in this manner. And there's also like an issue brought up of like, oh, if they name someone, are they committing libel? And Mr. Bradley just simply doesn't care about that. And he's concerned with things like many mystery writers of the day were. I can't help but to think maybe Mr. Bradley is a tribute to Agatha Christie. He seems to write novels like Christie does, and we know Barkley and Christie were friends. Just a year after this novel was published, they founded the Detection Club together, and Christie actually won a contest involving one of Barkley's earlier novels, Cicely Disappears. Mr. Bradley's middle name of Harrogate is suggestive of the town where Christie was discovered after she disappeared a few years earlier. Perhaps I'm reading too much into this, but Roger anyway has a great deal of respect for Mr. Bradley, and I adore him as well. And finally, we have Mr. Ambrose Chitterwick in his first appearance. Just later in 1929, Chitterwick would star in his own novel, The Piccadilly Murder. And Mr. Chitterwick definitely comes across as the most competent of this group of six, the only one who takes this task seriously, and he is the one who solves it. He is the only one whom I have faith actually did all of the actions he said he did, and he is sort of socially awkward within this group. He doesn't quite fit in, although he is well liked and well respected. And as we see in the Piccadilly murder, he is easily bullied and manipulated by others. He has a habit of like saying things he doesn't mean just because he was pressured, and he does always come through when needed, however. And readers will notice that he does get muddled. If I'm being honest, I mean, Chitterwick is probably my least favorite character of these six. He's far less entertaining and interesting than the others, although he does shine more in his other appearances. But as a character, he works. He's not a bad character by any means, but I do find him like the least notable of the six, or at least I probably would have if I didn't know he featured in other books. And that is all for this video. Again, a very long video this time. In the future, I'll try to work harder to keep the summary portion down, although I do like mixing my thoughts in with the summary rather than just like delivering a straight summary of a book you've probably read and don't want to hear reviewed again. I look forward to doing more of these like festive reviews. In 2024, I intend to review books that have special anniversaries throughout the year, but next week, I will discuss the worst mistakes made by Agatha Christie killers. So stay tuned for that. Make sure you like this video and subscribe so you keep up to date with the channel. Until next time, Mystery Files.